Star Trek Academy Collision Course, Chapter 37. The next day, after instruction period, Kirk and Spock both were given new orders. This time, Master Chief Gianni was not in good humor as she passed over the printed documents. Kirk hoped that meant he'd scored another win. He scanned the orders swiftly, then smiled, victorious. Both he and Spock had been transferred to an advanced engineering stream, which they were to join at once. "It is not logical," Spock said as they walked to Aldrin Hall to report. "It is for Starfleet." "How did you come by this low opinion?" Kirk felt no need to explain himself again. He changed the subject. "What makes our new order so illogical to you? I mean, more than usual." "We are still due for 3.5 weeks of basic training." Kirk shot him a wry glance. "As if there's anything more Gianni can teach you. You get everything right the first time." "That does make sense in my situation, but not for you. No offense intended." "Yeah, right. More like they saw my test scores and, having seen my brilliance, realized basic stuff for me was a waste of time." "Unlikely. I have observed that at the recruit level, Starfleet is a large and complex organization that can only operate by adhering to strict routine. Breaking that routine is most probably something that occurs only under remarkable circumstances." "Well, I'm a remarkable guy." "Or," Spock continued, as if Kirk hadn't spoken, "the situation is being manipulated." Kirk halted in his tracks. "Run that one by me again." Spock stopped, took up a position with his hands behind his back as if speaking to someone of higher rank. "I merely point out that our new orders are not typical of how the STC operates." Kirk gave him a skeptical look. "How would you know how things typically operate around here?" Spock seemed surprised by the question. "I have read the recruit's manual." "We've been here 3 days, Stretch. That thing's 1,100 pages. 1,120, including the index." "Whatever." Kirk waved away the Vulcan's automatic elaboration. "You're suggesting that someone, for some reason, has plucked us out of the crowd to give us special treatment?" "Different treatment," Spock amended. Yeah. Kirk regarded him with sharpened interest. "I know I don't qualify for different treatment because my engineering aptitude comes nowhere near yours. So why are we both assigned to an engineering specialty?" Spock's face took on a thoughtful look, as if he found the back-and-forth inquiry engaging. "Rather than think of those characteristics by which we differ, it might be more illuminating if we think of those characteristics we share." "Okay," Kirk said, impatient. "So that rules out ears, sense of humor, and speed reading. How are we the same?" "Most obviously," Spock began, "in the way we came to the STC. Though not unheard of, it is rare for offenders to be given a chance to enlist." Kirk thought that point over and concluded that the Vulcan might be onto something that he himself had missed. "Okay, Stretch, here's something else that's the same for both of us. We got caught up in Griffin's operation. At least I did. And I brought you along for the ride." "Interesting," Spock said, and Kirk was sure the Vulcan had thought of another connection. "You think that's it?" Kirk asked him. "Someone's moving us around because of something we know about Griffin? These orders, they might have come out of nowhere because you stirred something up when you called the embassy." Spock's face lost any discernible expression. "You didn't call the embassy?" "I was not given permission to make a personal call." "2 Vulcans might have been murdered. That must mean something to you." Kirk studied Spock, wondering if this Vulcan, was capable of lying after all, and then, almost at the same time, he wondered what could trigger him to do so. "We should resume walking," Spock said, and did. So did Kirk. They were less than 200 meters from Aldrin Hall. "Perhaps when we are established in our new specialty stream, I will have another chance to request a personal call." Now Kirk was certain Spock was keeping something back. "Just tell them it's your father's birthday or your parents' anniversary. Starfleet's a sucker for family togetherness." "Sucker," Spock repeated, looking pleased. "Ah," Now I understand. Kirk wished he could say the same. An hour later, Spock gazed out the window of the monorail, contemplating the mystery before him. A theft ring was operating within the Vulcan embassy, and his father was implicated as a thief, both stealing and selling stolen artifacts, though that was, of course, impossible. Yet Sarek did know of the theft ring's existence, and even claimed that the compound security agents knew about it as well, although he had not trusted his son enough to confide this to him. What Spock had been able to determine on his own, firsthand, were the names of the criminals buying the stolen artifacts and the location of their base of operations in the Pacific Rim. To those details, he now added the information unwittingly provided by Jim Kirk, which implied it was likely the same criminals were also involved in the dilithium theft from the Academy, a theft for which Kirk claimed his female friend Alyssa had been falsely accused. But implication and second-hand data supported only supposition. What if he had acted on uncertain logic? Most troubling of all to Spock was Kirk's insistence that Alyssa had been set up. It seemed the Academy Honor Board agreed. The charges against her had been dropped, apparently as a result of Kirk's efforts to clear her name. As Spock continued his search for patterns, he arrived at one possible match, a disturbing possibility. Sarek was also being falsely accused. Spock had no direct experience with criminal conspiracies, but in his studies of the classic literature of this world, especially the masterful works of M. Spillane and E. McBain, he had learned that diverting suspicion through false evidence could be a successful strategy. He took a moment to consider this new line of thought. If Alyssa and Sarek both were set up to serve as misdirection, then what was the correct direction? What was the link between the stolen Vulcan artifacts and the stolen dilithium? And how did all the facts and suppositions he'd gathered fit into his suspicion that he and Kirk were both being steered into specific positions as recruits within Starfleet? No matter how many ways he viewed this problem, all of Spock's logic invariably converged on only one possible conclusion. Another, bigger crime was being planned, and he and Kirk were being put into place to take the blame. It would follow then that, if his own conclusion was true, Kirk's corollary was also true. Such powers of manipulation could be exercised only by a person or persons in Starfleet itself. What other way was there to explain how he and Kirk had received their offers to enlist and their current change of orders? Spock knew the situation, though clear, was dangerous to him personally. He was a lone teenager on an alien world, unable to trust anyone in his compound, not even his parents. And if whoever was behind this ominous conspiracy would not hesitate to murder 2 Vulcan consular agents, then they certainly would have no compunctions about killing him or Kirk. The 2 of them were pawns in some larger game, as surely as if they were ceramic pieces being moved among the levels of a chessboard. And when pawns came under attack, there was only one possible response: mount an offensive. Spock's body pitched forward suddenly as the monorail car slowed with a jerk, then inclined sharply downward, plunging into what felt like an endless fall. Completely taken by surprise, Spock did what no Vulcan child ever would. He cried out in alarm. I warned you about the force field, Kirk said. Everything back where it should be? Stomach? Eyeballs? Spock sat ramrod upright on the bench seat, face as frozen as a statue's. If Kirk had to guess, he'd say the Vulcan was embarrassed by what had just happened. We are in a precarious situation, Spock said. Kirk had come to understand a little about his Vulcan companion by now. Spock was probably not referring to being startled by the monorail maneuver. Tell me about it. Spock raised his eyebrows. This is hardly the place to discuss. Kirk waved him to silence. Another colloquialism, Stretch. I meant, I understand. I agree. The monorail car slowed. Kirk glanced at Spock and regained his general purpose equanimity. By any chance, did you mean our position is even more precarious than you thought it was before? Spock nodded once. We need to take action at once. Now you're talking. Kirk almost punched the Vulcan in the shoulder, but knew better by now. The car stopped and the doors opened. Counterattack, Kirk said fiercely. For once, Spock didn't question or protest. As ordered, Kirk and Spock reported to a small lecture hall in Lily 1, the main lab of the complex. They had both been given advanced standing in the STC Warp Propulsion Specialty course already underway. But before they could attend the course, they would first need to complete a day-long orientation lecture and safety training tour, then pass a follow-up examination. Given that there were no lectures and tours for enlisted personnel scheduled, Kirk and Spock had been added to a group of Academy plebes, first-year mids, who just arrived for early orientation. Kirk surveyed the 5 plebes clustered together down at the lecturer's level in the center of the hall. There were too few of them to bother with sitting in the banks of seats that ringed the small amphitheater. The plebes were all male, all fresh-faced and eager, with recruit-like stubble on their heads, and wearing immaculate midshipman gray uniforms, quite different from the baggy SDC whites Kirk and Spock wore. All were the epitome of what Kirk had always termed suckers. He and Spock walked down the aisles and stood just behind the clustered plebes. Kirk shifted restlessly from one foot to another, while an earnest orientation officer in a pale blue lab coat delivered a sanitized history lecture about Lily Sloan, leaving out the best parts of her stormy, on-again, off-again relationship with Zephram Cochrane. Next up was a safety officer, also in a lab coat. Her lecture topic was more interesting to Kirk. All the horrific ways careless mids could die in the warp lab should anything go wrong when they weren't prepared. At the end of her talk, the safety officer opened a case of Delta radiation monitors on the lectern beside her and called out the first participant's name. Dido, Andrew Jude. Kirk didn't hide his disdainful smile as a dark-eyed young man with black bristles covering his freshly shorn scalp marched up to the lectern with all the bearing of someone who was about to receive a Medal of Valor. Dewhurst, Philip Peter. Another eager young mid stepped forward proudly, this one as pale-skinned as the first had been tanned. Mubarak, Bish Salim. This mid was the tallest, and marched as if he had practiced for hours. Kirk leaned over to Spock to whisper something sarcastic, but the Vulcan wasn't watching the parade of mids. He was holding one hand to his chest, apparently deep in thought. "Something bothering you?" Kirk asked him quietly. Spock had seemed to recover from his monorail whiplash, but who knew with Vulcans? Why would they be giving us Delta radiation monitors? So they can tell the difference between us being cooked medium and well done, Kirk said. Why do you think they're giving them to us? Silver, Charles Anthony, the safety officer called out. This blonde and blue-eyed plebe was older than the others, and from the way he marched, Kirk guessed he'd grown up on another world with slightly different gravity. He still didn't have his Earth legs. If the static warp core in this complex is not in operation, Spock said in a low voice, then there is no chance of anyone being exposed to Delta radiation. Therefore, assigning monitors is illogical. Kirk watched Spock's hand at his chest. You sure you're not hurt or anything? Swartz, Philip Frederick, the last plebe reported to the safety officer, green eyes intent, looking very serious. I am in excellent health, Spock said, almost petulantly. Then what's the problem? Kirk asked. They probably just want us to get used to wearing monitors. Kirk, James Tiberius? Kirk chose to saunter, not march, to the safety officer, who pinned the thumb-sized monitor to his uniform, turned it on to make the green safe indicator light up, then pointed out to him the blue danger light. Kirk showed her he knew where the alert button was and walked back to join Spock behind the plebes, except Spock wasn't there, until he reappeared a moment later. He'd been on one knee, adjusting one of his boots. Spock. Mr. Spock? Naturally, Spock attracted the attention of all 5 plebes as he received his Delta radiation monitor and had it demonstrated for him. Back in his place with Kirk, Spock stood quietly as the safety officer then held up a small audio unit and played the lab's 7 different alarm tones, defining each. She pointed out, quite unnecessarily, Kirk thought, that no one had ever actually heard the final steady tone alarm, because by the time that one sounded, every living thing inside the complex's force field would already be dead. Starfleet humor, Kirk whispered to Spock. But Spock was lost in thought again, staring straight ahead. Kirk sighed in relief when, after an interminable hour, the lecture part of the program came to a close and another orientation officer entered. This one, though, wore a full Starfleet uniform complete with red shirt, no lab coat for him. The officer looked over the 7 members of his group, paying no more or less attention to Spock than to any other person. And then he said the words Kirk had been waiting for, the words that meant he and Spock could at last take action, fight back, find the evidence, and reveal the truth once and for all. "Head out this door," the officer said, "turn left, and proceed across the plaza to the warp core facility, what we like to call Ground Zero. Yeoman Bell will give you your tricorders at the main door." Tricorders, Kirk thought. Yes! The rest of this was going to be easy. Chapter 38. It was the scene of the crime, and Kirk couldn't have been happier. Ground Zero, also known as the Warp Demonstration Lab, was an austere industrial hall roughly the size of a tennis court. Half of it was given over to the traditional tiers of raised seats facing the other half, the lab area proper. There, a fully operational Class E shuttle warp core lay on a series of support pylons bolted to the floor. 5.5 meters long, 0.5 meter in diameter, the core was a few years behind the latest Class F models used on modern shuttlecraft. But in basic design and function, it was little different from the first dual nacelle cores hand-built by Cochrane for use in the Phoenix and later the Bonaventure. Despite himself, Kirk whistled softly as he walked down the steep stairs that divided the tiered seats. "2 of those can do Warp 3 for a week," he told Spock, "on less than 5 kilos of antimatter." "Vulcan shuttles can achieve Warp 5, Spock remarked, ending the discussion. As he made his way down the rest of the stairs and then across the lab area to stand by the core with the others, Kirk took careful note of the layout. The floor in this lab was gray polyduranium, textured for traction. Though there was no need for that here, as the floor was quite unlikely to pitch and yaw, Kirk knew it was the decking of choice for most Starfleet engine rooms. He guessed that it had been installed in this lab simply to lend authenticity. Since the banks of engineering computers were arranged about 2 meters away from the warp core, Kirk reckoned the test warp bubble it created was smaller than the cleared area. That area was clearly delineated by alternating hash marks of yellow and black. Blank for now, a large status board hung down from the high ceiling to the right of the core. The display board was angled for viewing both by any operators assigned to the control station to the left and by the students in the tiered seats. There were no windows. The lab was underground. Some of its illumination came from work lights mounted over key computer stations, but mostly it came from bright light strips hanging from the ceiling. In the shadows above these fixtures, Kirk saw reinforced support beams and an intricate weaving of brightly painted pipes and conduits carrying everything from fresh air to fire suppression gases. Very few of the drab gray wall surfaces were finished to any extent. Kirk had the sense the Warp Core Demonstration Lab was in a constant state of change, perhaps to keep up with new developments in the technology. Then he saw what he had come for, the dilithium vault. It was in a far corner, though still visible from the student seats, a squat cube about chest height and, like the warp core pylons, bolted directly into the polyduranium floor. A security input panel was located beside the vault's door. Mounted below the door were 2 polished metal arms that could be swung up like rails to position the dilithium holding frame while it was being slid into or out of the vault interior once the door had been opened. Overall, The vault was clearly not as secure as one that might be found in a civilian setting, so Kirk guessed it was like the floor here, a recreation of the kind of security installation found on board a Starfleet vessel. No wonder it was so easy to break into, Kirk thought. Of course, he reminded himself, on a vessel underway, the engine room would always be staffed, and there would be little opportunity for anyone to surreptitiously gain access to the vault. In this teaching lab, anyone who went to the vault would have to pass the operators, but if no operators were on duty and the lab wasn't in use, then there would be many times that there would be no one here to be a witness. To Kirk, that meant there had to be surveillance devices in place. As the orientation officer began to identify the main parts of the core, Kirk looked around to locate the visual sensors he knew had to be present. They were easy to spot, ringing the lab from wall mounts, and they were all standard. Good, he thought. They'd be as easy to fool with a sensor repeater as the ones he'd outwitted in the Starfleet parking lot last week. Mr. Kirk! Kirk started guiltily and shifted his full attention to the annoyed red-shirted officer. Since you're clearly so familiar with warp technology, perhaps you could tell the group why this grill is located in this position and not where it would be easier to service. Kirk drew a blank, groaned inwardly. He'd heard nothing of the officer's lecture while he'd been scanning the room. If he were now sent from the lab in disgrace, that'd be the end of any attempt to search the vault. Beside him, Spock raised his hand to his mouth, coughed in such a way that it almost sounded as if he had said, "Plasma intercooler." Kirk blinked and refocused his gaze on the officer. The man was standing near the raised grills of an intercooler access plate. That was all he needed to know. He began rattling off his answer to the challenge. The plasma intercooler provides plasma coolant to the warp drive. In the event of overheating, emergency cooling can be manually initiated by a forced coolant dump. If the intercooler access grill was located in a position more convenient for servicing, that would also mean that in the event of a dump, superheated coolant would be directed toward the vehicle instead of away from it, with the potential to cause a catastrophic hull breach and loss of vehicle. The officer nodded, pleased. Well done, recruit. That's word for word. Is it your habit to memorize every textbook you read? Just the interesting ones, sir. The officer looked at the other mids. That's how it's done, gentlemen. He patted the core. You work with one of these, with 200 fellow crew depending on it to get them home. And when something goes wrong, there's no time to look up procedures in the computer. Everything you need to know to save your ship and your crew has to be burned into permanent memory. He tapped the side of his head. Right here. The officer then walked over to the nacelle cap and swung open the dome to reveal the photonic impeller blades. As he began to describe their operation, Kirk gave Spock the elbow. Spock at once drew back, but nodded as Kirk whispered, Thanks for protecting my back. Kirk braced himself for the inevitable question, but Spock had a different question for him. Have you actually memorized an entire warp propulsion textbook? The Vulcan whispered. Why? Kirk asked. Don't think we humans have it in us? But it was obvious that wasn't what Spock meant. I was only curious to know when someone with your aversion to Starfleet would have had occasion to read such a text. Kirk brushed off his interest. Long space voyages. He pointed to the dilithium vault in the corner. Can you get a reading on that? See if you can pick up a carrier from the dormant jamming circuit? Spock examined the two parts of the tricorder he carried, the sensor wand in one hand, the main body hanging on a strap from his shoulder. He flicked the sensor on, checked the main unit's display. In theory, yes, but I shall need to be closer. He looked apologetic. This is marked as a training tricorder, and its range has been severely restricted. Very illogical. Not really, Kirk said. It's to avoid temptation. Spock didn't understand. Tune it to the right frequencies, and you can use it to see through clothes. Spock was appalled. Kirk suppressed a laugh. We'll get closer, he said. Then, to avoid being asked a question about something he might not have memorized so many years ago, he paid attention to the rest of the officer's continuing lecture. Much as he hated to admit it, it was kind of interesting. "45 minutes later, Kirk hadn't managed to get any closer to the dilithium vault, and the red-shirted officer was directing his group up the stairs, telling them how to proceed to the next point on their tour. Kirk let the mids go first, then slipped his ball cap out of the utility pocket on his uniform trousers and moved to drop the cap along the side of his leg to land behind his seat back. Spock was the only one to have seen what he did, but before he could say anything, Kirk shook his head no and motioned for the Vulcan to start up the stairs. Waiting at the lift in the corridor, Kirk suddenly raised his hand to get the officer's attention. "Sir, my cover must have fallen out of my pocket. May I go back to get it?" All the mids looked at Kirk. Caps weren't part of their uniforms. Neither were pockets. "In the lab?" the officer asked. "I believe so, sir." "You have 2 minutes. Go." "Yes, sir." Kirk ran back to the lab, counting seconds. Outside the main doors, he set the tricorder to visual scan, opened one door crack, slipped the sensor wand through, and captured a visual image of the empty lab beyond. Then, using a trick Junie Ben had shown him, he opened the back of the tricorder, removed the thumbnail-size range delimiter card from the main sensor input, and reset the power output to maximum. What? Now the tricorder was capable of transmitting a sensor signal consisting of any pattern already stored in its memory. Kirk had turned the device into a crude sensor repeater. As his count reached 40, Kirk pushed through the doors and charged down the stairs. With the tricorder transmitting the visual image of the empty lab, no visual sensor would record his presence, he hoped. By a count of 65, he was beside the dilithium vault, out of breath. He checked for the positions of the visual sensors, then slid down to the floor on the far side of the vault with his back to it. In this position, he couldn't be seen, and he changed the tricorder's function from transmit to scan. By 75, he'd begun to sweep up and down the translinear spectrum, trying to get an echo back from any nearby duotronic circuitry designed to dampen a security alarm. He found it, focused, moved the sensor wand back and forth, and there it was, a clear signal coming from the door of the vault, just as he'd suspected. The circuit that had protected the real thieves from discovery had been installed as part of the vault's upgrade. The count was 90, but Kirk didn't care. He'd estimated that once he'd been gone for the 2-minute mark, it would take another 30 seconds for the officer to reach the lab to search for him. If he was running up the stairs with his cap by then, everything would be fine, which meant he still had more than a minute to open the vault and grab the thieves' circuit, recording everything with his tricorder to show to Federation security. Kirk stood directly in front of the vault door, adjusted the tricorder to function as an override, then aimed the device at the vault, knowing he was now being recorded by the visual sensors. But that didn't matter anymore. He had nothing to hide. The authorities would have to listen to him. He activated the jamming circuitry with a standard signal, then took a breath and, counting on Starfleet doing everything by the book, entered Alyssa's security code into the tricorder's transmit function and pressed send. Now that Alyssa had been cleared of all wrongdoing, he anticipated that her codes had been restored, and they had. Kirk almost whooped with relief as the vault door's lights blinked on one by one, and he heard it click open. He put the sensor wand on top of the vault, swung the thick door open, and there was nothing in the holding frame. The dilithium that had replaced the stolen crystals was gone. Kirk recovered swiftly, decided that couldn't be his problem now. He'd lost count of how much time he had, knew he had to hurry. He checked the inner surface of the vault door, saw the access panel where the upgraded circuits had been installed. And in the same instant that he realized he had nothing he could use to open that panel, a strange musical note rose up, and the vault was washed by a flickering golden light. Transporter. With a sinking feeling, Kirk slowly turned, just as 3 Starfleet security officers with drawn laser pistols solidified around him. Kirk raised his hands. "I can explain," he said. No one was interested. Chapter 39. 14-year-old Jimmy Kirk ran across the hard, frozen ground toward the glade that bordered the Layton farm. The cold air burned his lungs, but he couldn't let that stop him. The kids were out here somewhere. His kids, his responsibility. As the oldest in the cabin, he'd made sure their clothes were clean, and they wrote notes back to their families and read the lessons about crop rotation and how to care for trans cattle. But now he couldn't fool himself anymore about what was really happening. He couldn't look the other way and hope for the best. His job was to keep his kids alive. He reached the edge of the glade, and the trees there rose up like a wave about to crash, a wall of black blocking the faint star glow of night. He paused to catch his breath before plunging into the utter darkness of the glade, searching desperately for any sign of the path the kids might have taken. Then his eyes caught a red flicker to the left, another, 2 more after that, laser fire in the glade. He flinched, apprehensive, afraid to call out. But he took off in the direction of the shots, running helter-skelter, banging into trees, stumbling over roots and fallen logs, catching his own laser rifle on low branches. He was lost and on his own, and the only thing that kept him moving was his kids. Up ahead, he saw the flash and glow of palm lights moving in a clearing. At once, he forced himself to slow down and breathe quietly while he crept up to the clearing's edge, maintaining cover. He needed to see who held the palm lights and what they were doing. Adults, 2 of them. He thought he might have glimpsed other people in the clearing, maybe huddled or lying on the ground on the other side, but the palm lights no longer shone there, so he couldn't tell. He held his position, unsure what to do, worried that Matthew and his followers would come crashing through from the other side. Then he'd never find the missing kids. He thought quickly, frantically, then decided to let the adults go on their way and dare crossing the clearing by himself. He tried not to think of what he might find on the other side, but if any of his kids were hiding there, then at least he'd see what had happened to them. He concentrated on the 2 tall figures who stood together in the clearing, their palm lights spilling down, illuminating their legs and boots, but nothing else. They appeared to be looking at something one of them held. Jimmy could see the pale blue glow that came up from it. It was just like the light from a small sensor display. Then, Jimmy blinked. For just a moment, one of the adults seemed to have 2 heads. He didn't think there were any aliens in this colony. He didn't know of any aliens with 2 heads. Would aliens be part of a rescue party? The 2 figures turned in his direction, and Jimmy was pinned in the palm lights. The beams were so bright, his eyes hurt, and he couldn't see to run. In his instant panic, he barely heard the voice calling out to him, "It's all right, child, come out. Nothing bad will happen." Jimmy froze, conflicted. He knew that voice. It sounded kind. "There's someone here who thinks he knows you. Jimmy?" It was Donnie Roy. "Jimmy, I'm cold. Please help me." Jimmy had no choice. He stood up and pushed through the last crackling barricade of old dry branches and into the clearing, holding one hand to shield his eyes from the lights. "Donnie?" He was close enough now to see the 2 adults clearly. One was an older teenager unknown to him. The other was a red-haired man with a high forehead, a neatly trimmed beard and mustache. He looked familiar, maybe one of the farmers he'd met this summer. "Kirk?" the man asked, solving the mystery of why he'd appeared to have 2 heads. He was carrying Donnie inside his cloak. Now Jimmy knew why the red-haired man's voice was familiar. He'd heard it on the public address announcement. "I'm Jimmy Kirk. Are you the governor?" "I am," the man confirmed. "Were you looking for your friend here?" Kirk nodded. For no reason he could articulate, he knew he shouldn't mention he was looking for other kids, too. "Well, there you go, then." The governor gently let Donnie to the ground, and the little boy ran to Jimmy and wrapped his arms around his legs. Jimmy could feel his shivering. "I've heard good things about you, Kirk. That's why you're on my list. You understand what it means to be on my list?" Jimmy's fingers went to the red bandana he wore. "That's right. It means you're working for me now, helping our colony survive difficult times, doing what we have to do. Do you agree?" Jimmy could barely find his voice, but he managed to say, "Yes, sir." "Good." The governor patted Donnie's head. "Are you ready to help with this little fellow?" Jimmy didn't know what was expected of him, so he repeated what he'd said before. Yes, sir. The governor looked down at Jimmy sternly. I want you to take him back to the storehouses. Go to any of the big tables there. He pulled out a yellow card, handed it to Jimmy. Give this to someone at the table. Anyone with a red bandana, and tell them it's for your friend. They'll make sure he's reunited with his parents. The governor paused and gave Jimmy a piercing look. It's important for children to be with their parents at a time like this. In difficult times, it's the best way, the only way. Jimmy looked at the card. It said Tarsus 4, Emergency Measures Act, Group 2. That was all. Questions? No, sir. Next! The governor reached into his pocket again, handed him another yellow card. You give them this card for you. Group 2, just like Donnie's, whoever this kid is. I know you don't have parents here, but my people at the table will take care of you as well. Oh, and you won't need this anymore. The governor took Jimmy's rifle from him. I'll take it back for you. Jimmy fought to keep his thoughts from showing on his face. He knew to a certainty that the yellow cards meant he and Donnie would be killed. The governor hadn't finished his instructions. If you find any more of your friends on your way back to the storehouses, those cards will work for them too. Be sure to tell them that. If they go back to the storehouses with you, they'll join their parents or their guardians somewhere nice and warm, and they won't have to worry about being hungry. Understand? Jimmy understood that the only reason the governor wasn't killing him right now was because other children needed to be rounded up, like the ostriches and trans cattle. Yes, sir, he said in as strong a voice as he could muster. The governor looked down at him, considering. His calm, measured breaths wreathed him in the spilled radiance of the palm lights, the glow like a nebula in deep space. Jimmy knew he would never forget that face, that voice, if he lived. Off you go, then. Do your part to help us all. Jimmy reached down for Donnie and lifted the small boy into his arms, willing himself to walk away, not flee in panic. Not that way, the governor said. Jimmy had started for the clearing's far side, where he thought he might have seen some other huddled children, and now he turned back. The governor was pointing to the dense bank of trees. That's the quickest way back. Yes, sir, Jimmy said. What he didn't say was what he knew now. The other kids were dead. Holding Donnie tight against him, he walked into shadow. Jimmy wished with all his heart that his dad were here. His dad and his dad's starship and all his dad's friends in their uniforms, beaming down with food and lasers and warm clothes. He wished that someone, anyone, would come to take this darkness from him. Silently in his mind, Jimmy sent out his call of distress, over and over calling for his dad and for Starfleet to save them all. That cry still echoed in the mind of 17-year-old Jim Kirk when he woke in the darkness of his cell in the STC brig. 3 years on, and he still wished that someone would save him. Spock was given 15 minutes with the prisoner in the bright orange jumpsuit. Stretch, what's new? Could you be more specific? Spock considered his question most reasonable, but Kirk frowned and leaned over the small gray metal table where the guards had led them. Okay, then. Who's ahead in the lacrosse playoffs? What do you think I mean? Spock waited a moment before he spoke again. It was possible, he decided, that Kirk had been inquiring in a very imprecise manner about a general update. He edged his hard metal chair closer to the table, folded his hands, and leaned forward as well. Then he glanced to both sides to be certain the two guards weren't in position to overhear or read lips. I suspect Griffin is within 48 hours of departing. Kirk leaned even closer. How do you know? He is in the process of beaming freight containers from the Pacific Rim to an orbiting private cruiser. Kirk grimaced as if in pain. Spock regarded him with some concern. I mean, how do you know? Did they let you off the center? Ah, Spock said. In addition to obtaining dilithium and staff cars, Griffin has been purchasing rare artifacts stolen from the Vulcan embassy by Vulcan staff. He'd already decided he could trust the human, at least that much. This time, Kirk looked confused. Yeah, so? Spock leaned closer. As I pursued the mystery of the embassy thefts, I presented myself as someone who could also supply Vulcan artifacts. Kirk nodded, impatient. Let's speed this along, Stretch. They only gave us 15 minutes. I sold one to Dala, a small figurine. It was a forgery, of course, undetectable by most methods because it contains a special transmitter that creates a false sensor image to make it appear authentic. Kirk looked impressed. Like a sensor repeater. Spock knew that the transmitter he had designed was significantly better and more sophisticated than any sensor repeater Kirk had built, but decided this was not the time to remind the human of his inferiority. The principles are somewhat the same, he allowed. But that still doesn't explain how you know what Griffin's up to right now. Spock idly brought a hand up to tap his chest, making certain the outline of his Idic medallion could be seen through his white shirt. The forged artifact contains a transmitter, he repeated. Kirk's smile came more quickly than Spock had anticipated. And that thing you're wearing is a receiver. Spock folded his hands again. That's why you were worried about the Delta radiation monitors, Kirk said. You had to hide the receiver in your boot so you wouldn't set the monitor off when they pinned it right on top. As you said, we only have 15 minutes, Spock reminded Kirk. What else do you know? But Spock had obtained few other facts through his listening device in Griffin's office. So that the device would remain undetected, Spock had programmed it to record sound for hours at a time, then compress the data and transmit it at random intervals in microsecond-long subspace bursts. Many times it had simply recorded hours of silence when Griffin's office was not in use. He had, however, used his personal study time to access the Starfleet computer network from the STC's library. I did obtain a list of Starfleet material that has been stolen or reported missing in the past year, which is the period over which Griffin's organization has been active. I believe he has assembled a collection of items which, if properly modified, will allow him to build a small vessel that will appear to all sensor scans as a legitimate Starfleet shuttlecraft. Spock took Kirk's intent listening as a human's attempt to mentally recreate his logic. He was on the verge of telling him that they did not have enough time to complete such an exercise when Kirk held up a hand to suggest he not speak, which would then give Griffin a Starfleet shuttle that no one would suspect because no actual Starfleet shuttle will be known to have been stolen. Exactly, Spock agreed, surprised and impressed once again. What particular use Griffin intends for such a vessel, I do not know. The possibilities are many. Any theory why the Starfleet geniuses haven't figured this out? Spock blinked. I believe that Starfleet analysts are not sufficiently devious to think as Griffin does. Kirk grinned. And you are? I have studied the literature quite extensively. Ah, and your conclusion, Sherlock? Spock. Time's almost up, Kirk warned. I believe that Starfleet analysts are aware of Griffin's obtaining stolen Vulcan artifacts and cannot reconcile those items with the other stolen goods. Their failure to do so prevents them from seeing how all the items fit the same pattern. You think the artifacts have something to do with building a fake Starfleet shuttlecraft? Spock nodded, and just as he was about to guide the human through every step of his subtle yet inexorable chain of logic, Kirk snapped his fingers and interrupted. Griffin knows the artifacts are forgeries. Spock's eyebrows rose, beyond his conscious control. That was it, precisely. Griffin knows all the Vulcan artifacts are forgeries. Yours and the ones from the embassy staff. Kirk's restless mood had changed completely. Now it was sharp, intense, focused. But that's okay, because he only wants the circuits inside them that can fool sensors. He can use those to complete the illusion of the fake Starfleet vehicle he wants to build. That conclusion was like a flash of lightning to Spock. Was it possible that there never was a criminal conspiracy inside the embassy? Could he have instead detected An official covert effort by embassy personnel to infiltrate an outside criminal conspiracy? If so, then the original artifacts had never been taken. They would still be safe somewhere inside the embassy. The logic of the plan unfolded with painful precision before Spock. Embassy personnel would have created 2 copies of each artifact they'd stolen. One copy, with sensor-deceiving circuits, had been passed on to Griffin. The second copy, what he had found in the embassy cabinet, would have been created as a safeguard against the possibility that Griffin somehow tried to verify that the embassy thieves had left duplicates in place of the originals. "You still there?" Kirk asked. Spock wrenched his attention back to the present. "One more question that needs your logic," Kirk said. "When you go through that list of things that Griffin's stolen, is there anything he's missing? One last thing he needs to get before he goes, so he can build his fake ship?" Spock nodded. He had already run that exercise. The dilithium Griffin stole from the Academy is approximately half the amount he would need to operate a Starfleet-class warp drive suitable for a shuttlecraft. Kirk's jaw tightened, an indication Spock knew that he was pursuing a thought with whatever baffling thought processes he used instead of logic. "You know, I actually got as far as opening that dilithium vault before they arrested me." That fact Spock hadn't known. The only information he'd been able to retrieve from the Starfleet computer system was that recruit Kirk had been arrested and charged with attempted theft, and that midshipman Corso had been implicated as his accomplice and was facing separation from the Academy. Additional details of the alleged crime were classified. Presumably, that was to prevent others from identifying the security flaws that had allowed the attempted crime to take place. "In other circumstances," Spock said, "I would offer congratulations." "The thing is," Kirk said, "the maintenance log I accessed last week said that the stolen dilithium had been replaced with a new shipment. But when I opened the vault, it was empty. Is there any chance Griffin managed to make off with the rest of it?" Spock was pleased he knew the correct answer to that question. That he did so was one of the reasons his engineering course schedule had been rearranged this week. "Dilithium is, as always, in short supply," he explained. "The replacement crystals that were shipped to the Sloan complex have been requisitioned for more vital purposes, which would be, the Starship Enterprise is nearing the end of her refit, well ahead of schedule. The dilithium intended for her is still in transit from Delta Vega. Therefore, in order to expedite the calibration of her new engines, the dilithium from the Sloan complex was transferred to space dock 2 days ago." "And no one told me," Kirk complained. "You were not in the..." From the human's expression, Spock realized he should stop there. Another colloquialism? Sarcasm. Kirk hit his fist against his open palm. "So that's what we need to do." Spock stared at him, concerned his concentration faltered again, and he had missed something significant Kirk had said. "Think of it, Stretch. A starship undergoing refit. It won't have a full crew. Construction staff will be coming and going all the time. It's got to be a lot easier sneaking on board a vessel like that than getting into ground zero." Spock didn't like the way the conversation was going. "Sneaking on board? Griffin's going to go after that dilithium," Kirk said. "And he's going to go after it in the next 48 hours. Spock knew he wasn't keeping up with the human's rudimentary logic, and so did the human. "That was your conclusion," Kirk reminded him. "He's getting set to go in 48 hours, and he needs that dilithium. All we have to do is get up on the Enterprise before him, wait for him to make his move, and we catch him in the act in the middle of space dock, where he can't possibly get away." Their time was up. The guards were walking toward the table. Spock stood regarding Kirk in Vulcan disbelief. "What?" Kirk said. "That's logical, isn't it? Except for one key point. You are in the brig. Just figure out how to get us on board that ship. Leave the details to me." Chapter 40. Even after centuries of war, disaster, and reconstruction, some traditions remain unchanged, and on Earth, the concept of the weekend still held sway. For the mids of the Academy, the 2-day break and routine that followed every 5-day period of intensely scheduled activity was a time for independent study, private pursuits, and for some, catch-up sleep. But for these 2 days in late August for the recruits of the STC, It was also their first weekend liberty, and sleep was something that could be put off till early Monday morning. As Spock prepared his bunk and locker for Saturday morning inspection, he was well aware of the plans the remaining members of Gold Team had made for their liberty. He was also well aware of their attempts to make it clear that none of their plans included him. Even if he had been human, Spock doubted that exclusion would have troubled him. His own weekend plans were full, and there was certainly nothing he would share with any of his so-called teammates. He thought it unlikely that any of them would have the desire to risk spending the next 2 years in a penal colony, no matter how noble the cause. In fact, the more Spock contemplated what he had planned, the more he thought it unlikely that until 2 weeks ago he would have contemplated spending the next 2 years in a Starfleet penal colony. But then 2 weeks ago he hadn't met Jim Kirk. By 0800 hours, Gold Team had dispersed for the weekend, most going off in groups. Spock walked by himself to the center's main gate, where an embassy car awaited him, hovering in a holding area. As he got in the car and it soared away, he wondered if he'd be returning to Starfleet on Sunday night, or ever. There were no weekend breaks in the brig. Kirk was roused at 0500, and an extruded breakfast was passed to him through the security bars of his cell. He was given 30 minutes to prepare for the day's work detail. It didn't matter that he had not yet been before a court-martial. Unlike his status at the time of his first brush with Starfleet authorities, he was no longer a civilian, and a different set of rules applied. Just by having lied to an officer about leaving his hat behind in order to gain unauthorized access to a secure facility, the Ground Zero lab, Kirk was enjoying 10 days incarceration at hard labor. And, the guards promised him, those 10 days would be a vacation compared to what was in store for him in New Zealand, the place he'd be going as soon as his court-martial was over. The guards' cocky attitude set Kirk off, and he assured them in graphic detail that he had no intention of going to New Zealand or spending 10 days at hard labor, or remaining 1 hour longer than absolutely necessary in Starfleet. The guards enjoyed his tirade, and an hour later Kirk was standing with a shovel, up to his knees with 4 other prisoners, in backed-up waste in the sub-basement of STC Building No. 5. "Start shoveling," the crew boss told them. "Join Starfleet, smell the worlds," one of the prisoners muttered. Kirk just shoveled, knowing he wouldn't be here for long, though if asked, he couldn't have said exactly how he knew he would escape. The Kirshara was the embodiment of Surak's teachings, which were in turn the foundation of Vulcan civilization. A replica of the ancient device, appearing to be nothing more than a narrow stone pyramid, scarcely a meter tall, stood in a place of honor in the meditation garden of the Vulcan compound. It was there Spock found his father, contemplating the artifact that mirrored so well the conundrum faced by every modern Vulcan. How could it be that something so vital to the rule of logic had been lost by Vulcans, only to be found by a human? For almost a century of Earth time, philosophers had contemplated that question. None to date had provided an answer. "Have you had enough of this?" Sarek asked as Spock approached. Spock's father wore a simple suit of brown cloth, devoid of any ceremonial gems or diplomatic markings. Spock was once again dressed in his dark civilian clothes and cloak. He saw his father raise an eyebrow as he noted his son's new hairstyle. "Enough of what?" Spock asked. He stood near his father, hands behind his back. Both kept their attention on the Kirshara now. "I believe humans would call it a game." Sarek did not bother to hide his disdain for the term from his son, though none but a Vulcan would recognize any change in Sarek's demeanor. "You mean my enlistment in Starfleet?" "Of course that is what I mean." Sarek was being short with Spock. Spock felt he was 10 years old again, being reprimanded for showing his dislike of being taunted by the other Vulcan children. "I find it an interesting experience." "So is fasting for 12 days, but that does not mean one should fast for a year." "My enlistment term is 2 years. I expect that time to be enlightening and educational." "It will be a waste of your time." Spock had never heard his father speak so harshly. "Father, by virtually all standards, I am an adult. I have the right to choose the direction of my education." Sarek turned his attention from Spock to the alien blue sky above. Except for that glaring anomaly, because of the garden's design, only Vulcan vegetation and Vulcan buildings could be seen surrounding it. This was a place of refuge for those too long from their home world. Even the air here was scented with the dust and dried grasses of Vulcan's deserts. "You have been confused by this world," Sarek said. "I assure you I have not." Sarek cleared his throat. Spock often heard him do that when delivering a speech he did not entirely agree with. "Very well. If you wish to be treated as an adult, then I will arrange for you to receive a diplomatic security clearance. That will allow you to be told the details of what you believe to be a criminal enterprise operating within these walls." "I know all the details." Sarek gave him a skeptical look. "The artifacts," Spock began, "that are being sold to a criminal organization run by a human known as Abel Griffin are forgeries, equipped with devices that return false sensor readings. In this manner, our embassy is cooperating with Earth authorities to learn the secrets of the organization, with emphasis on determining the reason for the unusual items it apparently is stealing." Sarek looked at Spock as if he couldn't be certain it really was his son before him. "You deduce this?" Sarek asked. "Through logic?" "An investigation. Impressive." Spock tried not to blush. Now he couldn't remember his father ever praising him so unreservedly. "Thank you." "Do you wish to know the rest?" Sarek asked. "Yes." "Then you will need a security clearance." Spock sensed his father was setting a logic trap. "Have I not already demonstrated that I deserve one?" "Not by the little you managed to uncover on your own." Spock knew he was stepping into the trap, but he had to know what his father was up to. "Very well. How will I obtain the clearance?" "Resign from Starfleet. Accept your admission to the Science Academy." Sarek fixed his unblinking gaze on his son. "Then I will know you are an adult." "And if I do not do as you suggest?" "Spock, it would be illogical of you not to do as I suggest." Spock was unable to control the flush of shame those cruel words sparked in him. "I regret the need to be so blunt," Sarek said, though it was too late to cushion the shock of his insult. "But it is true." Spock had never been so furious with his father. Calmly, he escalated their confrontation. "The consular agents, Strad and Kest, have been murdered by Abel Griffin." Sarek was so startled he took a step back from Spock before recovering. "We thought that might be a possibility. How do you know it to be true?" "From an eyewitness." "Who? The human boy whom broiled you in this?" "No," Spock said. And I involved myself when I discovered you did not trust me enough to tell me the truth." "Spock, use your logic. 2 of our consular agents have been murdered. Do you not understand the danger you face by your actions? My decision was not based on any measurement of my trust in you. It was based on my desire to protect you from harm." "Why would you not tell me that at the time?" Sarek gave Spock a look of subtle amusement. "Imagine the questions that admission would have unleashed from you. In that, you are much like your mother. Against all logic, it sometimes seems as if she is drawn to danger and excitement." "Interesting," Spock said. He had never considered that aspect of his mother's personality before, but he suddenly saw the logic in it. From a human perspective, how else to account for the desire to wed an alien and spend one's life on an alien world, if not in at least some small part for the excitement? "Interesting is not an answer," Sarek said. "I will not resign from Starfleet at this time." "May I ask why?" "The fact that you requested my resignation as a condition of telling me more about the theft ring suggests that the theft ring and Starfleet are connected. That confirms my assessment of what it is the theft ring wants." Sarek was intrigued. "And what is your assessment?" But Spock saw no reason for answering. If his own father, perhaps one of the most brilliant minds on Earth at this time, had not been able to deduce that Griffin was intent on stealing the material needed to build the Starfleet shuttlecraft, then it could only mean that vital information had been withheld from him. And since the Vulcan embassy was merely assisting investigation, that implied that the vital information was being withheld by Starfleet itself. Spock was suddenly struck by the realization that Jim Kirk might be right, and that at some level of command, Starfleet itself could not be trusted. Spock, Sarek asked again, will you tell me your assessment? Spock followed through the likely chain of events that would be set in motion if his father was given data that the conspirators did not want him to have. None of the outcomes was acceptable. No, Spock said, because it was the only answer he could give. Sarek lifted his head in affront. For what reason? Because I wish to keep you from harm, Spock thought. But he could not voice that concern to his father. It would only inspire Sarek to redouble his efforts and bring him closer to the truth the conspirators did not want him to have. I regret that I cannot tell you at this time, Spock said. He checked the angle of the sun, calculated the time. There's still a great deal more for him to do. I must go now. Where? I have things to do. Related to this investigation of yours? I would rather not say. Spock held up his hand, moved his fingers apart in the ancient gesture. Peace and long life. Then he turned away. But Sarek followed, almost as if he intended to block his son's way. Spock, you are an alien on an alien world. What can you do? Spock turned to face his father, so many things becoming clear to him. You are mistaken, father. On Earth, you are an alien, but like my mother, I am not.